Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jan Schroeder. I am one of the co-founders of the Cyber Leadership Institute. I'm also joined here this evening by our CEO and co-founder, Phil Zongo, as my co-host for this webinar. We've got an exciting hour for you ahead with three experts on cyber risk quantification who's going to share their knowledge with us. I'll do a quick introduction, and then I will also get them to introduce themselves after that. But before we do that, maybe just a quick reminder of what this webinar is about. So you would have seen that we are talking about cyber risk quantification, which is not a new topic. It's a topic that's been around a long time. I recall almost 20 years ago doing a presentation to AISA, the Australian Information Security Association, about cyber risk quantification. And the New South Wales government at the time issued a document or a guide document, ROSI, which was called Return on Security Investment, and was basically a cyber risk quantification methodology. And that methodology was supposed to have been adopted by all government departments when they were asking for funding about cybersecurity. The problem was there was no recognized mechanism for people to implement cyber risk quantification. So as you do when you ask for funding, people just made up the numbers and made sure that the numbers stacked up so that the business case could stack up. So over time, there's been spurts of interest in cyber risk quantification. And then over the last few years, we've suddenly seen this topic grow again. And part of that has been the FAIR Institute that's really been pushing the agenda on cyber risk quantification. But the other side of it has been the growth in really computing power to be applied to this topic. And that's really what spurred a lot of the ability to do cyber risk quantification at scale. And so what we will talk about today is not just cyber risk quantification in theory, but cyber risk quantification in practice, because it's, as they say, the difference between theory and practice is what works in theory doesn't always work in practice. And so our focus will be very much on the practical application of cyber risk quantification and the practical implementation of cyber risk quantification at scale in organizations to be able to help manage your cyber risk posture. So let me introduce our three panel members to you. Our first panel member is Daniel Giesler. Daniel is the Group CISO of the Oerlikon Group, which is a large industrial group based in Switzerland, or headquartered in Switzerland, but operating in, I think, 37 different countries, more than 10,000 employees, and a very big group. Daniel's also a big football fan, and he tells me that he doesn't support a specific team. He follows specific coaches, and you can ask him afterwards about which coaches it is that he's supporting, but you can probably guess. Our next guest is Paul Kelly. Paul is a veteran of the industry as far as the use of data for decision-making goes. Paul is currently the interim group head of operational resilience at London Stock Exchange Group, and he was formerly the global head of cyber risk at HSBC, and previously also worked at JP Morgan Chase. And he's also a strategic advisor on cyber risk quantification to the Bulbix Group. And speaking about Bulbix, we also have Sid Wai from Bulbix here. Sid is the product manager of Bulbix. Prior to being at Bulbix, was at PwC, where he led model design and delivery of PwC's cyber and third-party risk quantification projects for clients. As you can see, very good expertise on the panel here this evening. Maybe just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will then put them to the panelists if we get a chance to do so. We are following Chatham House rules. For those of you not familiar with Chatham House rules, basically it says that you can use the information that you get in this forum for any purposes, but you are not able to attribute it to a specific person. So if you can't go outside and publish on Twitter that Paul Kelly said cyber risk quantification is XYZ. So please bear that in mind. The other thing to also bear in mind is that the views of the participants are their own. That includes ourselves, and it also includes all our panel members. So it was also not the official view or a supported view of any of their employer organizations. The normal conference type rules apply. So let's jump straight into it, and we'll start with a bit of an icebreaker question and ask each of our panelists how they got into cyber risk quantification in the first instance, because it's not something that you decide one morning, wake up and decide I'm going to go and specialize in cyber risk quantification. So how did your journey start with cyber risk quantification? And maybe we start with Daniel. So you just told us earlier that he's still on the journey.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan. And I'm more than happy to maybe talk about a little bit on our journey. I also can say that in the very beginning, it was not the cyber risk quantification what was in scope, rather than having a clear understanding what actually we do have in our environment. So the first initial question, what actually is connected to our network? Is it an accurate figures which I have or not? So that was the first question, which get me some sleepless night, if I'm really sure. And there it all started off. And then, of course, the cyber risk and all these kind of topics then came into the game as soon as we then started that journey. So that was the initial thing. And right now we are really on the journey, as you said correctly, to also go into a more specific thing in terms of cyber risk quantification.
And Paul, do you want to share your introduction to cyber risk quantification? It's probably a while ago, I suspect.
Yeah. So I started in a very different space. So I started with the space of, so I came from operational risk. And, classically, we've got our 5-box grids, 5x5 or 5x4 or whatever. And we're trying to calculate what or explain what our likelihood and impact is. And what you find is, one of the things that frustrated me was there is no standardized approach to how to do this. So we're relying on people's subjective view of this does this and this does this, right? And so we go, yeah, I'm very high. It's very high likely, very high impact. Okay, fine. Right, but then how are you taking your mitigants, or let's call them controls, and how are you justifying what that level of control does to move you from one box to another? Or indeed, if you don't know that, what is it? How do you know how you go from one box to another? So I started going, okay, right. Well, instead of relying on everybody to have their own opinion, let's start codifying this into if you have this, then that gets you here. If we have this in place, and we can get that there. And then you go, okay, well, how do you determine that? So what is that? Well, that means if you've got your endpoint security on every single endpoint and you can prove it, and it's at the right agent status, et cetera, then that probably buys us this much reduction in likelihood. And so you move on from there, and we go, well, actually now I'm collecting more and more data. So I've got a standardized approach to try to assess my risk. Let's call it risk assessment rather than necessarily risk quantification. And they say, okay, well, surely there's a better way to do this. And we can start to take objective views and then start to be, if we know what we've got in place and we know all the different activities, what happens how do we stop the different paths through MITRE ATT&CK? And we can start to get more and more granularity into it until we're starting to build. And that's where I started, until you get to actually, some of the things that are out there now and you go, wow, that's really quite good because it does it for me.
Right.
Fundamentally, I guess the answer is I wanted to move away from subjectivity and into objectivity.
Yeah, and we'll explore that a bit further as we go along. Sid, do you want to share your story?
Yes, absolutely.
From a quant background?
Yeah, sure. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So my background is of an actuary. So I spent a fair bit of my career working on risk and financial models, as you will expect. And one of the risk types was operational risk that I managed. And cyber is even now probably cyber is one of the key operational risks. And so that's the first introduction I got to CRQ, and then ever since I've had an interest in this area. And then, as you mentioned, Jan, I've spent about 5 years sort of working as a consultant, working with customers across the globe, building models and working with vendors in this space. So I'd like to have a good view of what works, what doesn't work, to be honest.
Excellent. So let's sort of take a bit of a big picture view firstly. So what do you see as some of the pros and cons of cyber risk quantification? Paul, you started with moving from subjectivity to more objectivity. But what other things do you see as the benefits, and then also what are some of the disadvantages of doing it or trying to do it, or some of the challenges of doing it? Paul, do you want to expand on your previous points?
Yeah, so fundamentally, what you're trying to do is to say, I mean, I guess let's go all the way back to the first question: is why do I want to do this? What is it I want to achieve? Mm. And that can be different things, right? There might be, I want to do this because I want to go and get a cyber insurance policy. So I want to be able to justify why that insurance policy is there, or I want to be able to drive down what my cyber insurance policy is. Or is it because I really want to understand my environment so that I can adjust my posture to meet the needs of my business? Or is it because, to your point at the beginning, was, am I doing it in order to get money from the board in order to continue with what I want to do? But even in that case, getting money from the board, is it because I then want to be able to target that money in the right place? Or do I just want to get money so I can go after my pet projects? Mm. And then I guess the follow on from there is I need to be able to prove that the money that they gave me had some effect. So I think that the levels are, you start with, why do I want to do this? And if you don't really know why you want to do it, then you need to start thinking about that. And then the question drives to how. And I think there are different models for doing this. So you take what I describe as the insurance model, which is based on the actuarial model. So I've got a business, I've got this level of control. A business like mine with this level of control typically has this much exposure, and we know we've got actuarial tables with all the historical losses, and we can do it like an insurance policy. If you do your house, you've got 5 lever mortise locks, etc. Well, that's how much you're going to have to pay. Or do I really want it to understand in detail what's going on in my environment because I want to fix it, which is the different approach, starting from sort of what Daniel was saying, what's connected to my environment. So you get to, actually, in my house, there's a candle right next to my curtains, and I probably want to deal with that. So those are, I think, what you want to do drives the different approach that you take. But fundamentally, for me, the real purpose has to be to enable me to make appropriate investment decisions in how I want to manage my posture and to make myself in a more secure environment. That would be my starting point. The dangers are you mismatch what the approach with what you want to achieve.
So one of the comments that a lot of people always come up with is to say, this is quite an expensive thing to do. One example is, we spent so much money with consultants and building a fancy model for us, and then eventually they came up with one number. And yes, we used that one number to justify the investment to the board, and maybe that was a good thing, but we can't keep on investing that amount of money into maintaining the model. So that's one of the challenges that you often find, especially if you're talking about, so that's obviously the high level strategic view. You want that sort of one big picture number. But if you want to make those more operational decisions that Daniel was talking about, that we want to understand our posture at a detailed level and be able to manage it. That's a problem of an entirely different scale. I don't know, Daniel, whether you want to expand on that a bit further.
I mean, you just bring it to the point. So once you have a kind of an overview on your environment, then you need to have something about almost real time, which is actually monitoring these things about different vulnerabilities. It's not only software vulnerabilities, but it's also configuration vulnerabilities and all these kind of things. So at the end, it's just a matter of reducing the attack surface. And if you don't know your attack surface, then you're lost already from the very beginning. So therefore, this is the fundamental thing. As we have it identified in our company. So we want to have a really strong view on our environment, what is actually going on, what do we have, and then also the exposure of each of the asset, because this is then putting up or higher up the attack surfaces, lower up the attack surface. And with all these kind of information, and this is a lot of information. So as you said, 0 days can come up anytime. So we need to be very, very fast to react on that. If now would a 0 day pop up, I would like to know it right away, once the 0 day is out there, and not wait for the next scan in the next several weeks or something like that. So this is the key element of addressing all the risks by knowing your attack surface in near real time, and then you don't have to invest, let's say, tools on top. As soon as you know that, then you can act on those things, what you get out of it as a result in terms of risk.
I guess with my point, just to add to what Daniel said, I think the cyber risk quantification doesn't need to be an expensive exercise. I think and the key here is automation, right? If you leverage the power of automation, and like Daniel said, as soon as something's a 0 day exploit's available, he wants to know about it. So automation reduces the area under the curve very quickly, and therefore you can use automation. It reduces any manual workloads that your current team have, right? You not only reduce cost, you reduce risk over a period of time, and you free up people to do more value add stuff while the platform will sort of do the number crunching for you. So again, with today, it's a data science problem. So you need to sort of look at automation to sort of drive efficiencies.
And from what you're saying, it sounds to me like, you're not just talking about automation of data capture and analysis, but you also automation, importantly, of the whole decision support down to the small minutiae of decisions around which vulnerabilities do you fix first, and is it worth spending money on them, etc. So with all of that in mind, this model's doing lots of, if you get to that level, you need that model to do lots of calculations all the time. How do you know that the numbers or the calculations that it does is reliable? We all know how difficult it is to estimate the likelihood of a cyber attack, for example, at the best of times, and there's lack of data available. So how do you make sure that the numbers that pop out of the model, whether it's at the strategic level or whether it's the operational level, are robust and that people can actually believe them? So do you want to start?
Sure. So I think on the 2 points that you mentioned, the first thing, your model, whatever model you use for cyber risk quantification, needs to consider business context, IT context, and cybersecurity context to give you a well-rounded view of what the breach risk to your organization is, right? And to be able to do that, you need to have quite a comprehensive calculation which considers various attributes of the risk, right? The second thing, or on the data point, we hear that a lot. I don't have the data. Some people complain there's too much data on the other hand, right? But the fact is, any mid-sized organization you work with today will have at least 10 to 15 upwards sources of data. Now, these come from various tools that you've already invested in. And it's that data that you need to pull in. You need to sort of build that picture from that data. It's not something subjective. It's objective data specific to your organization. And that needs to be the input into your risk calculation.
Yeah, so that side I get. So, the more you know about your environment, the better. But what about the external threat environment? And, that we know that's evolving all the time. How do you build that into it?
Yeah. So I think, going back to my answer to the original question, how do you have any trust in the model, should we say? And irrespective of which model you decide to go and use, that how does the model work needs to be clear and available to you to understand, so that you can understand it and you can buy into it, and it's consistent, right? And that's important. I think what Sid's talking about, and the way some of the models out there work is, okay, let's just start with identifying what is it that we're trying to protect. What do we actually have in our network? Our full hardware and software bill of materials. Now, let's just start there, right? Because how many people really understand their full hardware and software bill of materials and have it nailed in their CMDB or asset management, right? I there are lots of organizations who struggle with that. So let's just start with that, because we have what IT think, and then there's all the shadow IT that everybody else has bought that's hanging off of our network as well. And then what are the other bits and pieces that are out there? So let's so first off, let's get that. If we know that, and we can keep that up to date, because we can do that by taking the digital exhaust from the tools that are in our environment, deduplicating it, really understanding what's going on. Then we can say, okay, within that, we can apply all our CVEs. We can also look at password issues. We can look at configuration issues and all those pieces. We can then say, okay, due to these weaknesses, what's the likelihood of exploit? But in order to understand the likelihood of exploit, one is you need to have that continuously updated threat feed. So there are various organizations out there now that will give you that information. They'll give you what's going on in the dark web. They'll give you, is there an exploit live in the wild? Is it just a theoretical exploit? And they'll even go down to being able to say, no, your business or your sector is being targeted. So you bring that into the calculation. You then say, okay, what are the things that I've got in place that might prevent that? Now, in most organizations, you may have various different endpoints. And I don't think there's a tool out there that's going to tell you, CrowdStrike's better than McAfee or whatever. But you can say, okay, the agent that I have on my box is at the right, it's at the latest iteration, it is communicating, and I can put a score against that to say, okay, I've got some level of mitigation. And then you start to build up this, right, for each of my vulnerabilities, how exploitable is that vulnerability? And then you can start to run graph theorem over the top. So it's the maths that underpins your sat nav, for want of a better term. Yeah. So if you can imagine, right, what's the path through? And if we think around that using MITRE or somewhere like that, we can start to have an approach to calculate what's the likelihood of breach should we get here. So am I being targeted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then all we want to do over the top of that is run aggregate that across your entire organization, go, well, this is what my exposure is, and then run an optimization algorithm over the top to say, okay, what are the things that I need to fix first to bring that number down? And I guess, that, and the fidelity is understanding how that model's working for you, and then watching it over time to say, does this seem sensible? If it doesn't seem sensible, then you've got to go and investigate why it's not sensible.
So I said at Belbix, you've been sort of on this journey for a while. What's the, we all hear about AI models learning and being trained and needing big data sets to be trained and all that sort of thing. To what extent does this apply to this area, and to what extent, how far are we down the journey of these models really becoming smart enough? So everyone talks these days about ChatGPT and GPT-4 and all the alternatives that are coming out, and how that's evolved over 20 years or whatever the case might be. Where are we in the journey of cyber risk quantification models that are learning?
At Balvex, Jan, I think we have an ensemble of machine learning and AI models that sort of are purpose built to solve specific problems, right from, as we sort of explained. I mean, the way we build our flow within the Balvex platform is you ingest your data source, you create a unified risk model, and then you action on whatever the outcomes are, the metrics are. And that piece in the middle is where you've got various kinds of machine learning and AI models that are purpose built. Right. And to be honest, there are different types of machine learning models that are employed to sort of do different pieces of work. So you've got tensor to tensor, you've got deep learning. You've also got a couple of models that use the same technology as ChatGPT. So it depends on what the problem you're trying to solve. So it's a data science problem. There's so much data available now. The only way you can do it is leveraging automation using AI.
So Daniel, as someone who's been on this journey for a while, do you have a perspective on that? Do you, if you look at your models and the things that they produce, the answers that they're producing, and you compare that to the real world experience of your people, do they trust the model? How far do they trust the model?
Yeah, I would say this is one of the most important things. So if you look at the industry as we are, so we are not a bank or something like that, where we have a lot of people addressing these things. This one was one of the most important things, to have something in place which is reliable, brings us really priority-based risks on top to follow or to bring it down from top down, rather than having thousands of vulnerabilities showing up and making people exhausted. Well, there's another 1,000 now, and then tomorrow again 1,000. So therefore, this capability of a solution, what's it just elaborated, that's the most important thing on our side, because even though if the model may not, let's say, look into every single corner, but at the end it gives you a real time picture which helps us to really prioritize the tasks and also then of course make sure that our people do work in an efficient way on the priority one task and not on something which is not relevant. So therefore automation and also the algorithm behind it, this is one of the most important thing. And then at the end, how it is measured at the end, this is then something what we also can follow up in trends. So we clearly see a trend. If you do it like that, then the trend is going down in terms of mean time to patch in our case here, which is then also brilliant to show this kind of a result to another audience like internal audit or top management, because they understand these kind of figure rather than, well, we have 1,000 vulnerabilities. They can't deal with these kind of numbers. So therefore, this is essential and important.
Yeah, so that leads us to sort of some of the use cases. So, I think a few of you have mentioned already communication. Paul, in your experience, what's sort of the key points around using cyber risk quantification to communicate cyber risk more effectively to people who don't necessarily understand cyber and may think they understand risk?
Yeah, so I think that the benefit of it, we're starting to talk money, and most people understand, certainly in my industry, people understand risk-weighted assets. And what we're trying to do is to put a number, basically an exposure number, like we have, for our credit risk and our market risk, we've got this much exposure. Well, actually, for our cyber risk, we've got this much exposure. Now we can start talking exposure, which is, a currency that people understand and boards understand. But I think one of the benefits of doing an approach which looks at it on a regular basis, as opposed, some people may just choose to do once a year, and that goes back to why are you doing it? Well, we're doing it because we have to. But one of the benefits of having either in Daniel's case, sort of real time or continuously, is looking at the trend. And the reason for looking at the trend, and this might seem a bit strange, is but the trend is not always down. Because if the threat changes or new vulnerabilities change, you get a spike, right? Yeah. And then, okay, we now need to address the spike. But one of the benefits of being able to see that it fluctuates, and I think this is where you can start to explain things, because you're almost explaining it in market or credit risk terms, where we get new vulnerabilities every day, or not every day, but every sort of 12 days or so, and then we try to close them off every day. Well, is that any different from we're giving out new loans every day and they're being paid off every day? So there is a change. But what that enables you to have the conversation is the conversation around, or avoiding the conversation of, is it done yet? And getting people to understand that cyber risk isn't a static thing. Like, we put all these tools in place and we're done, right? We're really good. That it is a dynamic activity. And I think that's a bit that some boards miss. I've had in the past gone, well, we've given you this much money, is it not done yet? And you sort of say that you then have to go, it's that ability to demonstrate that this is an ongoing process and it's never going to end, because it is such a dynamic and the threats are changing, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's one of the benefits of it.
Yeah, Phil and I can share a story about a client that we worked with where the CFO kept pushing us to say, if we do all these things, will the risk be within appetite? And we said, well, we don't know, because the threat environment is changing all the time. But he kept on pushing us to say, if you do these things, are we going to be okay? And I think something like this would definitely help to be able to show that. So on those points, when you maybe Sid, you can comment as well. When you do see the trend ticking upwards, how easy is it's always obviously easier to explain when it goes downwards to say, look what a good job we're doing. But if it goes upwards, how do you explain that? How easy is it to explain, and how easy is it to attribute it back to the factors that caused that uptick in the risk profile?
Yeah, so I think you, as Paul's already alluded to, the curve will never be just in a downward trend like Patch Tuesday, right? I mean, vulnerabilities are released, and you will see a bit of a spike there in terms of based on how they affect your specific environment, right? And so, and occasionally you can see that trend go upwards. That's sort of indicative of, you know, how effective your patching is, your patching process, for example, is, you know, and then that leads to a slightly different conversation around, you know, what's, you know, we know that the mean time to weaponize is a lot smaller than the mean time to a patch a vulnerability, right? So what kind of behaviors are those trend line driving? I think that's the important question. You know, are my policy, SLA policy compliance the right level? Do I need to relook at it? You know, it opens a whole new conversation at the end of the day. So, and that's more towards the operational side of the house rather than strategic. You know, what's my risk appetite and how do I manage my business to my risk appetite?
Daniel, do we have you back with audio?
Yes. Sorry for that. I was interrupted somehow, but yeah, now I'm back.
Okay, good. So we're just talking about this when there's a spike upwards in risk profile, communicating that to stakeholders like your board or senior stakeholders. How easy is that to do? I mean, not in generic terms, but often, you know, they want more specifics around what caused it. If you look at that in practice, I'm assuming that happens to you from time to time, that the spike goes, that there's a spike upwards or a trend upwards rather than just downwards in the risk profile. How easy is it to then be able to identify what caused that, to be able to explain that or communicate that to stakeholders?
Let me take the example of the Log4j. I mean, that was in the news everywhere around the globe and so on. And I got so many questions where are we also affected? Are we also affected? And just trying to give a decent answer on that one was very difficult, and without having a tool in place who is actually able to cope with these kind of questions, so that you can then just simply go out and say, well, how many assets are affected for that vulnerability, which is now spreading around the news and so on in a crazy way. This gives you also a great, let's say, confidence that you feel comfortable more or less in sense that at least you are able to answer things rather than saying, well, I have no clue. So, and this is then also calming down, let's say, the upper management and all the people who are actually raising those kind of questions. This is really also a critical point if it comes to an example like that.
Yeah, no, that's a good example.
I think that's really important. Back to that, what we were talking about earlier about understanding your full hardware and software bill of materials, right? Do you understand all of these places? You don't, you know, the benefit of having that knowledge and having it kept up to date in near real time, as opposed to, have we got Log4j? I don't know. I've got to wait for the scans to happen to go and see if my environment, I've got it anywhere to find it. And then we're waiting, you know, a month to have done that. Now I know where this is. Now I can go and fix it. Well, actually, no, we've got 422 instances. They're here, and I've got a plan to fix. I mean, on that upward trend, what's interesting, and there are two bits to this, I think. One is the ability to show over time that despite the fact there are upward trends, that you can mitigate that in a reasonable period of time. That's quite good. Mean time to mitigate, because, you know, the classic, we've got, you know, a new patch comes out or whatever, we've got 60,000 servers, we can patch 59,000 in an hour, but that doesn't change the 1,000 where all the risk is, and that sits for 30 days. But having a system or a capability that tells you go fix these 1,000 first and shows you the impact of that on your risk, it gives you that sort of mean time to mitigate, which I think is a really powerful metric to show how well you are managing your cyber risk. The second piece is, and we haven't really talked about it, is using the modeling or whatever model you choose to have in place, and then trying to use it in a more predictive manner for the things that you want to show. So if you know, for example, that you are approaching a massive obsolescence cliff edge because nobody's invested in your obsolescence cliff edge, well, why don't you just move the model in time and go, right, okay, this is where we are today. And if we don't address this obsolescence issue, this is where we're going to be in 18 months' time. And this is how much. So you can start to use the model to explain the impact of the obsolescence activity on your risk exposure, for example. So there are lots of different ways to think about this. One of the other ones that we've been toying with is, you know, in your classic software development lifecycle, and we'll do our static and dynamic testing for vulnerabilities, and then there'll be some sort of urgent rush to say, no, we've got to go and get this application into production, and we'll fix it in production. We'll just risk accept it. And you go, well, okay, that's interesting. What about if you could then say, okay, I'm now going to take the vulnerabilities that we're going to release into the wild, put them into my risk quantification tool as vulnerabilities, and see how that changes our exposure before you make the decision to risk accept it. So I'm now going to take this piece of, you know, so you say we're going to deploy this code here, 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 and here. Great. We're going to deploy the code here, here, and here. We know those vulnerabilities. We add that in. Oh, and that changes our risk exposure by 200 million. Do you still want to go live, or do you want to fix it before we go live? So I think there's really powerful capabilities further down the line if you can develop these models.
So you're really talking about basically scenario planning using your base model, but built on your foundational risk model, which has the robust information, because otherwise you have to basically, when you do want to do scenario planning, you go into a room with a blank sheet of paper and you start planning, and you don't have the fundamental model, or you have a big spreadsheet that is difficult to build and difficult to maintain. So yeah, is that basically what you're saying?
Correct. Yeah. And I think, you know, over time, some of the stuff that I'm interested in is how do I build these risk models even further, and how do I add more information into them to make them more interesting. So if I can dynamically understand my application dependency mapping, if I can understand my process mapping, then I can even go down to, well, okay, what's the impact of this on my business process up here? Or I could subdivide it or play. I think the more you know, the more you can build these models.
I want to come back a little bit to a comment you made earlier, Paul, about, you said, I think, whatever risk quantification methodology you're using. So that's, you know, that's often what people are struggling with is, where do we start? What risk quantification methodology should we use? I don't know, Sid, with all your risk quantification background, whether you can just give a bit of an overview of, you know, is that a decision that people need to make, or is it a decision that evolves over time, or what is the, you know, how do you need to think about that problem?
Sure. Yeah. So I think if we take a step back, and what are the two main approaches to risk quantification that are that emerged over the last few years? One, if you categorize them, is the top-down approach, and the other one is a bottom-up approach, right? The top-down is more akin to what you have the FAIR methodology, the FAIR framework, right? Scenario-based is done at the top of the house, you know, at the enterprise level. Now, this methodology is a great starting point, you know. I mean, and it's when you don't have enough data, you know, you can use something like a FAIR framework to sort of start off with your CRQ journey. And it does suffer from certain limitations because it doesn't take into account the dynamic nature of cyber risk. Imagine if you want a new vulnerability to rise, you've got to run the calculation again and again, and it can take months before you come up with a number. It's also some of the data that you put into these calculations is stale already before it's actually gone into the computation. So I think you need to be aware of that. On the other hand, you've got the bottom-up approach, which is, you know, building something like a DIY data lake, right? Now, that's an incredibly challenging problem, right? And it's not for every organization. It's for the organizations that are more mature, at the more mature end of the spectrum. It's time and cost intensive as well, and the time to value for justifying your spend on that is much longer, right? So I think the model that works best is one which sort of brings both of them together. You know, it has the correct way of doing it is at an asset and vulnerability level. You build the picture. What is the risk of a particular asset, a group of assets, and the overall enterprise? That's the correct way to do it. And to be able to do that, you need to look at the asset, the attributes of the asset, the vulnerabilities on that asset, and how they're being exploited. You know, and what are the mitigating controls that you have in place for something like that? So, and again, now with advances in computation, as we've already spoken about, you know, getting started on that journey is pretty easy. I mean, you don't need to boil the ocean. You don't need to have an extensive exercise. Where do I get the data from? Who do I need to bring in external SMEs to help me do all this? It's your environment. It's all the investments you made previously that can be used to kickstart that journey. But it is a journey, and you need to refine as you go along.
So, yeah, Daniel, you called it a journey earlier as well. So, be interested to just explore what that journey looked like for you, and specifically from perspective of, you mentioned time to value. When we talk to people and we teach, cybersecurity strategy, we always say, let's focus on the crown jewels first, because that's your most critical assets. So does that also apply here when you implement these types of models in practice? Do you start with your most critical assets, or do you just start and say, let's scan everything, get everything into the database, and then see where we go? Daniel, because I think you started.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always talking about the journey, and the starting point of that journey was not very funny, I have to say, because there are so many things which popped up which we were unaware of. And this is then also something what you need to cope in the first time. So having, let's say, transparency and decent inventory doesn't gives you better sleep at night in the very beginning. So you then have to address these kind of things. And if you talk about crown jewels, of course, these are always in the focus, but where do you get hit most of the time? It's not on the crown jewel. You get hit somewhere else. And if you look right now at ransomware stuff and so, they don't care about crown jewels. They just get and hit you. And so you need to take care of almost everything, so to say, which helps you to really have some countermeasures in place against those kind of most critical, devastating risks we have in these days of ransomware. So therefore, the journey is really very tough in the beginning. Transparency doesn't gives you always a good feeling. It gives you a feeling about how much work is ahead of you, but over time, that was the interesting thing. So with the solution we have in place now, we were able to address it on a team-based approach. Let's say, if you have a dashboard covering the whole world with our 200 plus location, presenting that to a few guys doesn't help that much. But if you can present the risk and also the attack surface or whatever it is, vulnerabilities, on those specific teams, which are actually also responsible for, then this makes a great difference also for addressing the things. And you can then get into a kind of a competition within the teams. So if the Indian team is having a mean time to fetch, I'm coming back to that one, of 18 days, why should the US not also having an MTTP of 18 days? So you then enforce or start up a kind of a competition, which also then helps overall to bring the attack surface down in a very nice way. But starting point is not so funny once you have the transparency. What you have missed before.
So are you saying that your starting point is getting visibility, basically, is what you want initially?
Yes. Yeah.
And just to give people some sort of indication for an organization your size, how long did that process take you before you felt that we've got a reasonable amount of visibility here without having to necessarily have done anything about it?
Well, it's 1.5 year, something like that, because visibility is and also meaning you need to have the asset owner at the end. So all these things is really taking a lot of time, because there's a lot of things are popping up or things which you didn't even expect, and then you need to address it. But it as said, so 1.5 year, 2 years, something like that, and then you get to a level where you can then really be kind of quite confident that the path, the journey is on a controlled way.
And
just on that, Daniel, how long did it take you to know all of the unknowns that you needed to address?
The unknowns are, let's say, they're quite fast, I would say. But then to find the owner of those unknowns, then it's another story. Yeah? So then you really go and take your trainers on and then walk through the thing. Hey, what is this? What is that? And so on. This is then the cumbersome part, finding the asset owner and the responsibility and ownership of those devices.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's a good point, Paul. So you're saying you find out pretty quickly what you don't know, but then to try and understand it, own it, understand the business implication, all that sort of thing is probably where the real
that's why it takes a bit of time.
From your experience in large banks and those sort of larger environments, Paul, does this sort of time frame resonate with you? Or?
Yeah, I think I think that the benefit of something that helps you distill all of the digital exhaust, because let's face it, the tools that you've already got deployed, your CrowdStrikes, your NetFlow, you've got all sorts of IPFix data. There's all sorts of sources of data that you've got that actually help you see things, but you don't know that you've seen them. I mean, even Forescout, for example, that helps you see the things that are connected to your network. But all it does is, what you want to do is aggregate that and deduplicate that, and it just gives you a whole pile of unknowns. And that, to Daniel's point, takes a long time to work through those unknowns. But the good news is that you, within some degree of confidence, you think you know all they become known unknowns as opposed to unknown unknowns, if that makes sense. To be a bit Rumsfeldian about it. But at least with the known unknowns, you've got a set of stuff that you can work through. And and that's where machine learning helps with, okay, well, this asset looks like this, it's got this information. I mean, in recent experience in a different organization, when moving out of a data center that was purely owned by that organization, there are servers in there that we didn't know what they were. It took time to find out.
Yep. And
I think just on that, just to add to what Paul and Daniel said, I think one really good thing is when you're trying to get visibility of your entire estate is also to bring in business context of that particular asset in how it's used, how it interacts with the rest of the network, how it's used in the organization. That can help with as well. So I think let's not forget that business context is critical as well.
So said for Belbix, you've obviously got clients large and small doing this. So for smaller organizations, you're seeing similar sort of timeframes, or is it easier and much quicker for a small organization to get their arms around what their assets are and what their exposures are?
I think as a platform, irrespective of the size of the organization, it doesn't take very long to sort of surface and do coverage and gap analysis. I mean, you've got different tools, you ingest the data, and that brings out the visibility. And that's irrespective of, because of the modeling in place and that automation, it brings it out fairly quickly, irrespective of a small or a large organization. It's just, to Daniel's point, what do you do once you've got visibility, your identification, the owners and all, which is the time consuming part. So.
Yep. And so you made an interesting comment earlier where you said you do the top down as well as the bottom up. So we're talking a lot here about the bottom up implementation, but would you typically recommend people do the top down or start with the top down and do the bottom up after that, or start simultaneously and run them as parallel streams? Or what's your recommendation typically?
So I think having worked in the space, we've seen a few examples of what's out there. I think, in my opinion, the correct way to do it is that bottom-up asset view. You have to look at an individual asset, an individual vulnerability, and do the risk modeling based on that. Because once you do that, you're able to sort of understand what are my security controls. So, example, I've got CrowdStrike or any other EDR tool installed. How effective is that tool against that particular vulnerability, against those TTPs that are being used to exploit? That's when you start understanding what's my ROI. In the true sense. You can't just say I've got CrowdStrike, so my risk is 50% lower. We don't work that way, right? It's you need to go down to that TTP level to sort of determine that. Also, for each and every, let's say for a CVE, you might have more than one TTP, right? And you've got an EDR, but you might have a network control as well. So, you start talking about defense in depth and those kind of conversations, which are only possible when you look at that granular level.
Yep.
So
yeah, I've seen people do top-down risk modeling, etc., and then come up with an answer, and then when they then start doing some of the bottom-up, they realize that a lot of the assumptions they made in the top-down were actually invalid. And so that's one of the risks potentially in terms of starting with top-down. But in a small organization who have nothing in place, top-down's better than nothing. So and sometimes they can do that top-down relatively easily. Sometimes some of the insurance brokers could come and do a top-down thing for them in a reasonably short time frame. So there's some benefit in that potentially.
Yeah, I think that comes back to what do you want from it?
Yeah.
Right. And what are you trying to get out of it? I mean, the other thing I would say that if you were a small organization and you're purely cloud-based, you probably have a much better idea of all your assets anyway, because you're paying for them. Because the cloud provider is going to charge you by all the assets that you've got. So all you need, they know much more about the assets that you're using because they are going to use it to bill you. Whereas if you've got your own data center and you're managing your own data center, often we're not so good at that. And when it's expanded, or you've had M&A that's moved in and you haven't quite onboarded everybody else's servers, and the CMDBs didn't get joined up properly, and so on and so forth over time, and that's where things fall through the cracks and you no longer really understand what's going on. But I say, if you are a small organization and you are 100% cloud-based, then you probably have a really good understanding of most of your assets already, especially if you're not giving people you're not giving people laptops and all the other bits and pieces that you need to get into. So I still stick with Sid that if you really want to do this properly, you really need to understand your assets, and that's the piece, and then understand the delivery of your controls across your assets. Because even if you want to do the top down, you say, well, have you got an endpoint solution? Yes. Right. Well, is the answer really yes? Because I could have an endpoint solution and I can have it deployed on one machine. Yes, I've got an endpoint solution. It's like, exactly, or badly configured, all the rest of it, or and even in the cloud, are we managing our footprint in the cloud well? The other stories I've heard, or people have said to me, the server's only up for 15 seconds, it doesn't have time to download the latest antivirus. Why are you not managing your images? So there are all sorts of bits that we can delve into, but I think in order to validate that top down, you need to have a bottom, and so you may as well start at the bottom.
Yep, that's good. So we've been diving into the detail a bit, but maybe just stepping back in the last remaining 3 minutes, where do you see this going in the future? So are we we obviously at the starting point of using cyber risk quantification at scale in organizations to help manage your cyber risk posture, and that the field is evolving, but except for just the technology advancing and getting better at it, what else do you see as trends that people should be aware of? Maybe external trends or external influences, things that people should think about it when they look at their cyber risk quantification projects and planning that. Paul, do you want to?
I think one thing that I think we're still not really good at for all of our risk quantification or risk assessment. One thing we're not really good at is ability to quantify how well we can recover. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think there are really good tools that help us get there, and we need to think about how do we do that.
Yeah.
Right. How do we demonstrate that we've got the recovery capabilities? Because we can have a 0 day and that takes us right back to bare metal, and we have to start again. So we need to be thinking about that. And then I think the future is actually building bigger models by bringing in more information. If you bring in more information, you can start to build out not just cyber risk but tech risk, right? So if you can link your underlying assets all the way through to your business processes, and I just put a database of mean time between failure, for example, because I know what the mean time between failure of my components are, I can start to calculate just what's my risk of failure in my business process just due to component failure, nothing to do with cyber. And that's how do we start to build these models to really give us the situational awareness of what's going on in our environment to make a real difference to either our change planning, because the benefit to some of these other models is more broad than our ability to quantify. If we always know our starting point, we can change more quickly.
Yeah. And Daniel, in
I think it's more.
Daniel, in 30 seconds, what's on your wish list for the future?
Everything what helps in terms of speed to reduce the attack surface. So this is really one key element.
Yeah.
Speed is key, and it's all about, as said before, reducing the attack surface, and everything what helps is well appreciated on my side.
Excellent. Well, we're just about at the top of the hour, so I'd like to thank you very much for your participation in the webinar. Paul, Sid, and Daniel, thanks very much for sharing your insights with us. For all the participants, there will also be the opportunity to ask any further questions, and we will try to get our panelists or someone to respond to them as much as possible, so please keep the conversation going. If you want to hear more about Belbix, we will also post something in the hub just below the video to let you know how you can get in contact with them. I think Christoph Nemeth might be on the call. If not, we'll give you his details. He's one of our long-standing Cyber Leadership Institute members, and you can get through and get further details about Belbix as a platform as well. So once again, thanks very much everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.